If you've ever taken a history course that focuses on anything past World War II, you may have heard the term arms race cropping up a lot, especially in regards to the construction and deployment of nuclear weapons by two massive superpowers, the Soviet Union and the USA. Arms races are often associated with conflicting interests, competitive inventions, and technological innovation. Especially in the case of the Cold War, the decades of arms races led to multiple innovations, especially in the technology sector. However, today I want to focus on a more specific example, an example of an arms race that isn't widely known but is still fascinating nonetheless. The Anglo-German Naval Arms Race, which lasted from 1898 to 1912. The Anglo-German Naval Arms Race was a result of the new German Empire's aggressive push for dominance, and a desire by the country to be treated with the same respect as other established powers. You see, Germany at the time was a relatively new country, having been born out of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The creation of Germany affected the very delicate balance of powers, which was a system that it had existed since Napoleon, which proclaimed that every region needed a balance of alliances to ensure that nations wouldn't be incentivized to go to war with each other. For example, Russia's ambitions into the Balkans were balanced out by Turkey, French colonial power was balanced out by the United Kingdom, and Central Europe was meant to be balanced out by Prussia and Austria, the powers that had a large amount of influence in the region. You see, back then, much of Central Europe, aside from Prussia and Austria, were made up of many individual states, each ruled by their own leaders, such as monarchs, etc., and it was sway over these individual states that determined the balance of powers. The unification of the German state and the increasing movements of nationalism, militarism, and imperialism led to much worry amongst the traditional European powers. France had already been humiliated on land in the previously mentioned Franco-Prussian War, and the UK did not want to be humiliated on the sea. The creation of new German battleships threatened the UK, which had historically maintained defense of its trade routes, colonies, and homeland through the sheer quantity of new and innovative ships. They were the foremost economic power because of this naval dominance, and the newly industrialized and expansionist Germany threatened the supremacy of British might and power, which ticked them off more than a little. The British had a doctrine and rule known as the two-power standard, which stated that Britain must have more battleships than the next two largest navies combined, which were, at the time, France and Russia. This was done in order to allow the Royal Navy to naturally adapt to the changing demographics of naval supremacy. This was in spite of the fact that British naval power had not been challenged in a while, ever since Napoleon. The first naval act passed in 1898 in Germany, which promised the construction of 11 new battleships over the next 7 years. This was part of the German desire to have a fleet two-thirds the size of the Royal Navy, a direct contradiction of the two-power standard. Thus began the naval arms race between these two countries. Kaiser, or Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had fired the respected Otto von Bismarck, a man so impressive it would be difficult to summarize his life's accomplishments. But in a nutshell, he was the main architect behind German unity and worked to maintain positive diplomatic relations between Germany and the other powers of Europe. He worked to reduce tension and allow for the concept of a united German state to become more accepted throughout Europe. It was his life's mission to not only create a German state, but sustain it, and sustain it he did as the Chancellor of Germany for more than a decade. He pursued reluctant colonization and empire building, but also placed less emphasis on uniting with any specific European power. He had left German foreign relations and loyalty relatively ambiguous. He had worked well with Kaiser Wilhelm I, but Kaiser Wilhelm II felt more insecure about the popularity and power of Bismarck, and also disagreed with him on many foreign policy issues, and thus dismissed him in 1890. Kaiser Wilhelm II pushed for German aggression and expansionism through the rise in militarism, nationalist pride, and colonization. It was this radical shift that prompted further relations with Austria-Hungary and Italy, also known as the Triple Alliance. This was problematic for two reasons. First, it revealed Germany's political motivations and militaristic aspirations, which worried the other powers of Europe. Second, it motivated the creation of the Nightmare Alliance, the one thing that the former Chancellor Bismarck had hoped to avoid. The Nightmare Alliance referred to the alliance between France and Russia, which would, from a German perspective, put them in a position of fighting a war on two fronts, which would be disastrous if a war ever broke out. In the just over 10-year-long period between 1898 and 1912, there were 5 fleet acts passed in Germany that quickly developed their naval program, but it was the Second Naval Act in 1900 that worried British politicians, because the act doubled the German Navy and drastically changed naval demographics, meaning that Britain would have to change its shipbuilding policy in order to maintain the two-power standard. This worry prompted reorganization of the Royal Navy and the creation of a new class of battleship, known as the Dreadnought, with the creation of the HMS Dreadnought, which changed the future of naval technology. It was said that this single ship had the power of 2 to 3 normal battleships due to its speed, large guns, and armor plating. The HMS Dreadnought was such an innovative design that it immediately made every other battleship obsolete, including the ones that had already been produced by Germany. From that point on, the competition between Germany and the United Kingdom became fierce, with the Fourth Naval Act in 1908 leading to a new policy in Britain, which planned on building 6 new dreadnoughts. However, the arms race came to an end 2 years later in 1912 after it was realized by both countries that the construction and maintaining of new battleships and dreadnoughts every year was extremely costly, and that escalating tensions had isolated Germany. Russian military expansion was also threatening Germany's eastern border, and they could not continue to delegate as much funds to the construction of new battleships. Germany tried to secure one victory by signing a treaty with Britain accepting their naval superiority in exchange for neutrality, but the lack of any real threat from the German Navy at that point led to a British rejection of the treaty. In the end, the British could still say that, even after the arms race, they still had more battleships than the next 2 largest naval powers combined, which in 1914 were Germany with 17 battleships and France with 10. The British, however, had 29. Overall, the Anglo-German Naval Arms Race had several major consequences that would affect the beginning of World War I. First, it isolated Germany from Britain and showed the world that they were willing to do whatever they wanted, and whatever it would take to topple established powers. Second, it increased nationalism in both countries due to the competitive nature of the arms race. Thirdly, it led to an increase in innovation and the creation of new technology, the most obvious example being the HMS Dreadnought. And finally, it prompted Germany to turn to the construction of submarines rather than battleships to gain naval superiority, which would prove pivotal in the years to come. Thank you for watching this first video, and I hope you enjoyed.